This conference will now be recorded.
Okay, we'll get started here. I'll make the introduction as brief as possible, but first I want to thank Grover for doing this. He suggested this idea several months back, in fact, as far back as the fall of 2020. And this is basically going to be an overview of the role that the Christian church had initially in bringing slavery to America, defending the practice for more than 200 years and supporting segregation, even after Brown versus Board of Education. And Grover will be providing also examples of recent efforts by major denominations and affiliated organizations to acknowledge their history of support for slavery and to seek redemption. So without further ado, I'll let Grover get started here. Thanks, Grover, once again for doing this.
Thank you, Sandy. And thank all of you for your interest in this topic and your presence today. First, Plymouth began discussions a few years ago that led to the decision by the congregation to identify as a racial equity church. We continue to study the issues and how to live out that commitment. I hope today's discussion will contribute to an understanding and recognition of white supremacy and white privilege. What I'm going to present to you this morning is my perspective of the role of the white Christian church in the enterprise of chattel slavery and the establishment and preservation of white supremacy and systemic racism in America, which are continuing manifestations of slavery. Let's begin with some definitions. When I refer to slavery, I mean chattel slavery. There are other forms of indentured servitude, but I mean chattel slavery, which is the enslaving and owning of human beings and their offspring as property, able to be bought, sold, and forced to work without wages. The term white supremacy often conjures up the image of the KKK or Charlottesville or the mob violence at the Capitol on January 6th. But I believe a more appropriate definition is the one put forth by Eddie Glaude Jr., who's professor of African American Studies at Princeton University and a well-known commenter on race in America today. In his book, Democracy in Black, How Race Still Enslaves the American Soul, Professor Glaude writes, the phrase white supremacy conjures images of bad men in hooded robes who believe in white power, burn crosses, and scream the word nigger. But that's not quite what I mean here. On a broader level, white supremacy involves the way a society organizes itself and what and whom it chooses to value. And that's white supremacy with all the bluster. A set of policies and practices informed by the fundamental belief that white people are valued more than others. White privilege is difficult to define in a meaningful way for white people because it describes the benefits that we enjoy primarily because of our skin color and race and not on merit. And we take those benefits to be part of the natural landscape, and we're almost oblivious to them. The declaration of the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America to people of African descent, which was issued in June 2019, put it this way. A part of their declaration was captioned, slavery ended over 150 years ago, and I'm a white Lutheran who never owned slaves. How and why am I a part of this apology? A question that rivals discussion at a recent meeting of the racial equity team. In the US, people identified as white, this is the statement of the Evangelical Lutheran Church. In the US, people identified as white benefit from their skin color, whether or not they're descended from a slave-owning family, whether they're recent immigrants or their ancestors have been in this country for several generations, and whether they come from an upper or lower socioeconomic class. Racial systems have been constructed throughout history and have given social, economic, and political meaning to racial identities. In 1988, writer Peggy McIntosh expanded the understanding of white privilege as she developed a list of advantages enjoyed by white people simply because of skin color. These privileges range from normalizing whiteness through regular items, such as flesh-colored Band-Aids, to seeing white people widely represented as having founded this country. Within the church, white and black worshipers were raised with images and stained glass windows of a white Jesus and white disciples, and generally accepted these depictions as fact. In school, teachers and textbooks taught that the inventors, scientists, writers, and artists who built this country were primarily white. The Lutheran statement goes on, "Too often we hear in ourselves and in others that we are not racist. We are not privileged. After all, we may have grown up with few resources, and we have generally all worked for what we have. What we fail to see is that we have a moving platform as an airports of privilege, making our path easier. I benefit. I am privileged. My ancestors were able to vote, to obtain loans and build ownership, to have access to the schools and colleges of choice, to choose where to live. Those benefits accrue through the generations. Despite differences of socioeconomic class, white skin provides a benefit in and of itself. Unearned privilege runs deep, and white people can't escape it. It is not based on individual attitudes or behavior. Racism is a system of structural advantage. The concept of race was built for political and economic advantage for those who are white at the expense of indigenous people and people of color. Enslavement of people of African descent provided the free labor that built the US Capitol and many churches and university buildings, along with much of the wealth of the US. Okay, so much for definitions, but I hope these provide a context for some of what follows. My presentation has two parts. In the first part of the presentation, I'll briefly share information, as was advertised, that has received increasing attention in the past 2 years regarding the role that the white Christian church played in slavery and the efforts of several mainline Protestant denominations and their related institutions to acknowledge the role of slavery in their history and to seek ways to make amends. The second part is a testimonial. It is my personal story of growing up in the legally segregated South and continuing to live and work in the South for all of my career until coming to Denver 14 years ago, and how my church experience has shaped my perception of white supremacy and white privilege. There's a significant body of writing on the history of the church and slavery, much of which has been produced in the past 10 years, and to which I was totally oblivious until the middle of last year. The acknowledgement of this history by mainline Protestant denominations has occurred much more recently. My very first awareness of the complicity of the church in the slave trade and in the ownership of slaves by individual churches in the 18th and 19th centuries was in June of last year. A former pastor of ours in Virginia sent me an article that described how small Presbyterian churches in Virginia participated in the slave trade in order to support their operating budget. I'm not going to share this with the Stewardship Committee. It was a startling revelation, and as I continued to read, I was startled over and over again. I'm going to begin this introduction in the 18th and 19th centuries, when chattel slavery had become an integral part of the economy of the South. There is a story about the church's involvement in bringing slaves to North America from the very beginning, but I'm not covering that today. Slavery itself was never widespread in the North, though many Northern businessmen grew rich on the slave trade and investments in Southern plantations. Between 1774 and 1804, in that 30-year period, all of the Northern states abolished slavery, but the institution of slavery remained absolutely vital to the South, and it grew in importance following Eli Whitney's invention of the cotton gin in 1793. And cotton became a dominant cash crop in the South, which is very labor intensive. The U.S. Congress outlawed the African slave trade in 1808, but the domestic trade flourished, and the enslaved population in the U.S. nearly tripled over the next 50 years. Of course, when you own a slave, you also own their offspring forever. So the population of slaves who were here continued to grow, even though the importation from Africa ceased. By 1860, the slave population had reached nearly 4 million, with more than half living in the cotton-producing states of the South. What was the justification for slavery theologically? Slave owners had many justifications for why holding people in bondage was acceptable, and they found support, as well as opposition, within the church. From the idea that African Americans were a lesser race who needed taking care of by white patriarchs, the paternalistic argument, to the economic justification, slave owners were always trying to find new ways to dispute those who disagreed with their choice to hold others in captivity. Religion often came into play on both the slavery and anti-slavery sides of the debate. In 1835, at the end of 2 long articles about religion and slavery in the Charleston Mercury newspaper, it was said that both the Old and New Testament give permission to hold others as slaves. In the Old Testament, God and the patriarchs approve. As for the New Testament, Jesus and the apostles show that slavery is permissible. Therefore, slavery, to those who wrote the article, was not an anti-Christian institution. It was just the opposite. Such extremist beliefs were common in the slavery anti-slavery debate. Slaveholders believed that slavery would liberate Africans from their savage-like ways, especially if they were infused with Christianity. White Christian slaveholders argued that slavery was a necessary evil because it would control the sinful, less humane black race. Slave owners, beginning in the 1830s, began to permit black religious gatherings in some forms. In addition, Charleston slaves and free blacks were allowed to attend church with their owners. However, previous slave revolts, like Virginia's Nat Turner, caused worry that religion would make slaves think they had the right to be free. Turner experienced religious visions that caused him to believe that revolt was divinely ordained. Slaves allowed by their masters to worship were closely monitored thereafter. Even though the article in the Charleston Mercury claimed that Jesus supported slavery, the biblical truth is, according to J. Albert Harrell, a noted biblical scholar at Ohio State University, that Jesus was remarkably silent on the slavery issue. He never outright named it explicitly as a sin. Both sides of the slavery anti-slavery debate used this ambiguity to their advantage, embellishing the details that supported their case. The slaveholding South stretched the truth and claimed that Jesus permitted slavery. The anti-slavery North claimed that Jesus never said sodomy, blasphemy, and idolatry were sins, even though to Christians they clearly were. On both sides, overall, both sides of the debate used religion to their advantage, stretching the truth wherever necessary to help their cause. The conflict between the pro-slavery and anti-slavery constituencies within the church ultimately led to schisms in several of the mainline denominations, including Baptist, Methodist, Lutheran, Episcopal, and Presbyterian. And we wound up with Northern Presbyterian and Southern Presbyterian and so forth. I'm going to give examples from 2 denominations today. Similar stories exist for most of the other major denominations. And if anyone is interested, I have developed a reading list that would point you to some useful sources. But some of these stories read like novels. Presbyterians and slavery. The Presbyterian Church was a national denomination from the 18th century to the Civil War. American Presbyterianism encompassed a wide range of viewpoints on slavery. The church and prominent leaders in the church included slaveholders, moderate anti-slavery advocates, and abolitionists. The Reverend Francis McAmee is often regarded as the father of the denomination. He played a major role in forming early congregations, and he organized the first American Presbytery in 1706. He also held property in human beings. He was a slave owner, the founder of the Presbyterian Church. A native of Donegal, Ireland, Mackamy resided for some time in the British colony of Barbados, whose prosperity depended on slaves and sugar. And his residence in Barbados and trade with the colony financially supported his ministerial work in North America. Ends justifying means, I guess. Mackamy later married into a wealthy family in Accomack County on the eastern shore of Virginia, where he acquired substantial land holdings. His 1708 will listed and ordered the distribution of 33 chattel slaves. In her 2016 book, Institutional Slavery, Slaveholding Churches, Schools, Colleges, and Businesses in Virginia, 1680 to 1860, Bloomsburg University historian Jennifer Ost presents the largely untold story of Southern institutions that owned slaves, including church congregations, universities, free schools, and large industries. This takes us into the surreal world of slave-owning Presbyterian congregations in Prince Edward County, Virginia, which was the focus of the article that my former pastor from Virginia sent me last June, which started me on this journey of discovery. In 1766, members of Browary Presbyterian Church in Prince Edward County in Virginia confronted a serious problem. They had difficulty retaining a minister for their church because they had so little to offer as a salary. Therefore, the leaders of Browary Presbyterian, many of whom were slave owners, looked to the example of other early Virginia institutions to find a solution to their church's financial constraints. They decided to raise money for a permanent endowment which would be invested in slaves. The annual leasing of these church-owned slaves and their offspring would pay the minister's salary and fund other needs of the church, such as building maintenance. For the next 100 years, until the Emancipation Proclamation, the members of Browary Presbyterian were the beneficiaries of the labor of these slaves and their descendants. It worked this way. Browary used the funds from the endowment initially to purchase slaves. Each year, right after Christmas, the church would hold an auction and would lease each of the slaves, men, women, and children, for the next 12 months. This was obviously very disruptive and destabilizing to family life of the slaves. In many respects, it was more dehumanizing than ownership by a single master. At least being a slave family for a single master meant the family unit was maintained together, and you knew who your master was. In the case of Browary Presbyterian Church, they were selling these slaves one by one, breaking up families and selling them to different masters year after year. The Browary congregates were not the only Presbyterians to use slavery to benefit their church. Other Virginia Presbyterian churches were following the same path in the second half of the 18th century, particularly in the area surrounding Hampton-Sydney College, the Presbyterians' first institution of higher education in Virginia. All of these Presbyterian congregations were following the example set by Anglican parishes, as well as that of other institutions such as free schools and colleges, in using corporate slave ownership to benefit their organizations. The practice of slave owning created significant controversy in some of the congregations which owned slaves in the 19th century. It was, however, so deeply embedded in the Presbyterian culture and the economy by the antebellum period that it was very hard for many churches to rid themselves of the practice despite the controversy. That conflict resulted in two schisms in the Presbyterian Church, one in 1837 and the other in 1861, and reunion was not accomplished until more than 100 years later in 1971. Princeton University, founded as the College of New Jersey by the Presbyterian Church in 1746, reflects the central paradox at the heart of American history. From the very start, liberty and slavery were intertwined. The university boasts of being the site of an American victory during the Revolutionary War and of hosting the Continental Congress in Nassau Hall in 1783. The campus literature fails to note, however, that the first 9 presidents of the university, serving until 1854, held slaves at some point in their lives. The Princeton and Slavery Project, which you can Google, go to their website. The Princeton and Slavery Project developed from a small undergraduate research seminar first taught in the spring of 2013. The class sought evidence that might clarify whether Princeton University benefited from enslaved labor or money derived from slave labor. Students also sought to understand whether early college faculty and staff owned slaves, whether students brought slaves to campus, and how the larger culture of slavery in America shaped campus conversations and life. The research to date represents the collective work of 50 authors and 15 research assistants, including more than 40 undergraduates and graduate students at Princeton and faculty and colleagues at other institutions. The Princeton and Slavery Project has stimulated similar efforts of discovery at a number of other colleges and universities, most notably Georgetown University and Davidson College, another Presbyterian college, among others. The story of Georgetown is compellingly interesting, how it was discovered and what the issue was, but I will leave that for you to read or for another discussion. The second example is the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, which has really taken a leadership role in the last few years in examining its history of slavery and racism and bigotry and disclosing that and seeking to make amends. On December 12, 2018, the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, the first and oldest educational institution of the Southern Baptist Convention, which is the largest Protestant denomination in the US by far, with 15 million members and thousands of churches, disclosed that its 4 founders together owned more than 50 slaves as part of a wide-ranging reckoning over racism. The 71-page report released by the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, which I've read, is a recitation of decades of bigotry directed first at African slaves and later at African Americans. Beginning with the founding of the seminary in Greenville, South Carolina in 1859, the report found that the school, with few exceptions, backed a white supremacy ideology. Quote from the report, "The moral burden of history requires a more direct and far more candid acknowledgement of the legacy of this school and the horrifying realities of American slavery, Jim Crow segregation, racism, and even the avowal of white supremacy," wrote the president of the seminary, which is now located in Louisville, Kentucky. The Southern Baptist Convention has tried before to atone for its past. The denomination began in 1845 when it split from Baptists in the North over slavery. In 1995, on its 150th anniversary, the church issued a formal apology for its support of slavery and segregation. Last year, the convention, which has 15 million members in the United States, condemned white supremacists. 6 current and former faculty members spent a year researching the report. Their findings include the following statements. In its early years, faculty and trustees defended the morality of slaveholding. The faculty worked to preserve slavery, nervous that President Abraham Lincoln's election could doom the practice. After slaves were freed, one of the school's founders, Basil Manley Sr., called the Black people in Greenville an incubus and plague. The faculty, meanwhile, supported the restoration of white rule in the South during Reconstruction. A wealthy donor and chairman of the Board of Trustees, Josephine Brown, exploited mostly Black laborers in his coal mines in Georgia. He used the same brutal punishments once practiced by slave drivers. The faculty before the 1940s generally approved of the mythology that construed the Old South as an idyllic place for both slaves and masters, and claimed that the South went to war to uphold their honor rather than slavery. It also tried to use science to support its belief in white superiority. While faculty from the 1880s through the 1930s believed in white superiority, they also taught that Black Americans should have equal human rights and regretted the popularity of lynching across the South. They supported Black theological education as long as it was racially segregated. One school founder even chastised white Christians for assuming that their prayers were more acceptable to God than prayers by Black Christians. As I said, these are two examples of two prominent denominations. There are many similar stories about other Protestant denominations. I have not gotten very far in my exploration of the history of the UCC. Of course, the UCC was only formed as it currently exists, is constituted in 1957. But the Congregationalists, the Quakers, have a more noble history of abolitionist policies, and I think will escape some of the criticism and shame of their brethren in other denominations. Now I want to turn to my own confrontation with white supremacy and racism. I began to write this memoir following the murder of George Floyd on May 25th last year. Watching the horrid images, which still well up, of the inhumane treatment of Floyd played over and over, prompted my recall of many instances of racial injustice that I'd witnessed in the past. I decided to make a concerted effort to recall that past and to record some of the events in my life's journey that have shaped my views on racism so that I could share these with my children and grandchildren and others who might be interested. Bearing witness and voting are about the only ways that I can contribute to the search for resolution of the intractable issues of white supremacy and systemic racism at this stage in my life. Since moving to Denver in 2007, I've been surprised by the naiveness of my friends and family who are longtime Coloradans regarding the injustices experienced by Blacks, both historically and now, and almost a total lack of awareness of the life of Blacks in the South, then and now. I began to realize that the demographics of Colorado make it likely that most whites have very little contact with African Americans and are largely oblivious to the challenges that confront Blacks and other people of color in their daily living. The 12-county Denver metropolitan area has a population of in excess of 2.8 million people, approximately 2/3 of which are white and 1/3 non-white, but only 5% are Black as compared to 13% in the US population, and for example, 22% today in North Carolina, where I came from. The Ken Carroll community in Littleton, where Susie and I live, has a population of 34,000, and only 0.65% are Black. Our two grandchildren who have grown up in Ken Carroll Valley have had almost no interaction with Black peers in their public school experience. Our granddaughter did not have one single Black classmate in any of her classes from kindergarten through 8th grade. Our grandson had only one. They both now attend Mullen High School, which is a Catholic high school that aggressively pursues diversity through the use of scholarships and the attractiveness of a very fulsome athletic program. To recognize and to understand systemic racism and the white privilege that helps to preserve racism requires a very intentional effort, as was forcibly explained to us in the recent adult forum on the 4 reals. That understanding is a prerequisite to changing the world. The issue is extraordinarily complex, but white privilege is embedded in, because white privilege is embedded in every aspect of our society, although often in subtle ways that are part of the normal landscape for us and do not attract our attention. To most of us white folk, white privilege is normal, and we've been taught to believe that we have every right to expect the benefits that result. Back to the beginning. I was born in 1942 in Siler City, North Carolina, a small town with a population of 2,500 residents at that time. Siler City is located in the exact geographic center of the state, 50 miles due west of Raleigh. Some of you may remember the popular TV series, The Andy Griffith Show, which took place in the fictitious town of Mayberry. Occasionally, Sheriff Andy Taylor would say to Deputy Barney Fife that he was going to take a drive over to Siler City. When production of the series ended, Aunt B, Frances Bavier, retired to Siler City because she said it reminded her of Mayberry. She lived in a house 2 blocks from my parents until her death in 1989. My father became her personal physician. While there are some similarities between the all-white characters depicted in Mayberry and white folks in Siler City, Mayberry did not reveal the dark side of Siler City, which I observed growing up. The population of Siler City was 70% white and 30% black. The poorest whites were accorded higher status than the best educated and most well-to-do blacks. Siler City was segregated in every way that you can imagine, and there was nothing subtle about the class structure. No pretense. The blacks lived in Colored Town, which was literally on the other side of the train tracks. Blacks were addressed either by their first name or by any of several derogatory terms, but black people were expected to address whites by Mr., Mrs., or Miss, or other appropriate titles which connoted an elevated status. To do otherwise was considered disrespectful. Blacks were expected to know their place and to remain in it, and they were not to invade white space unless invited. That included stepping aside or into the street when approaching a white person on a sidewalk, for example. My father was a physician. His medical office had a separate entrance labeled colored and a separate waiting room for black patients. My two younger brothers and I did not understand that, and we've talked about it in years since. As a matter of logic, it did not make sense. Both waiting rooms led to the same reception area outside the treatment rooms. There was only one doctor, our father, and for him, as we watched him interact with patients over the years, a patient was a patient regardless of their color or ability to pay. My father was not wealthy by any standard that we would use to measure wealth today, but he was a highly regarded family physician in a small town and a leader in the community. And we did enjoy all of the trappings of middle-class white privilege. All of our needs were met and most of our wants. My mother was a registered nurse, and she worked as my father's office nurse until the second of her 3 sons was born. I was the firstborn, and during the first 3 years of my life, I was cared for by a young, full-time, live-in black nanny. My nanny's name was Bernice, and she died only 2 years ago. As I reflected on that recently, it dawned on me for the first time that I had a black surrogate mother for the first 3 years of my life. And for those 3 formative years, I spent more time during my waking hours with my black nanny than with my white biological mother. We also had a black maid 2 days a week and a black man who did yard work. That was not unusual for middle-class Southern white families at that time. Many of our neighbors had similar black help. The live-in nanny was a little unusual, but otherwise, our practices were similar to those of our peers. My mother, who as a nurse should have known better, boiled the dishes and silverware after serving the black help. What kind of a message does that send to your children? Recently, I asked my youngest brother to help me recall some aspects of our early years in Siler City. He recalled that our maid, whose name was Adelaide, would occasionally bring her daughter to work with her. One day, my mother overheard my brother, who must have been only 5 or 6 at the time. He's 4 years younger than me. My mother heard my brother propose marriage to our maid's daughter while they were sitting at the picnic table in the backyard. When I heard that, I laughed. He had never mentioned that to me before. And I was probably in school when that happened. He said that was the last time Adelaide brought her daughter with her to work. Wondered why. And my brother remembers receiving a stern lecture about the importance of racial separation from our mother. Our parents were generous people in many ways, and they truly believed that they treated blacks fairly. In fact, they thought they were very benevolent toward the blacks. One example, my mother kept a pack of Camel cigarettes and a carton of beer so she could provide the yard man a cigarette and a beer as a reward for good work. But my brothers and I were taught very clearly, explicitly and implicitly, that blacks were lesser beings and inferior in many ways, and that blacks existed to serve white people. My parents were not different in this respect. Similar values were imparted to our peers by their parents. That was the culture of the South. It also is racism. Siler City had a two-man police force, a chief and an assistant chief. The assistant chief liked to assert his authority. I recall several instances when the assistant chief, Leroy Pittman, shot unarmed black men on Saturday night in Colored Town, simply for being drunk and disorderly. He wasn't even called to Colored Town. He would just go down there to see what was going on and keep the peace. In 1952, when I was 9 years old, my father had been elected mayor. One of the shootings by the assistant police chief resulted in the death of the black victim who was unarmed and simply acting out. There was no outrage within the white community and no expression of condemnation. Rather, the shooting seemed to be viewed as acceptable. The policeman was merely doing his job in keeping the peace and keeping the black man in his place. I do not recall any conversation about this event at the dinner table. I reviewed the report in the local newspaper files recently to confirm my recollection. There was a brief trial that took only a couple of hours, and the assistant chief was acquitted by an all-white jury and continued in his role. The last hanging near my home was when my father was 11 years old. And it is said that a crowd of 5,000 turned out to witness the spectacle. There was attempted lynching when I was 12 years old, but the sheriff got wind of what was going on and arrived at the scene just before the young black man was going to be strung up, took him into custody and prevented the lynching. Ku Klux Klan was active during that period as well as I was growing up. Now, I was never at one of their rallies, but I knew people who wore the hoods and the white robes, and I knew their liturgy. The public schools that I attended were totally segregated. It was the era of separate but equal. But even to me as a child, the facilities were obviously not equal, nor were they in the eyes of any casual observer. The only blacks in the schools I attended were custodians and cafeteria workers. The unanimous landmark decision in Brown versus Board of Education, handed down in 1954, ruled that racial segregation in public schools was unconstitutional and that desegregation should occur with all deliberate speed. In fact, there was deliberately no speed. Rather, there was massive resistance to desegregation in the 13 states that had maintained legal segregation. And in response to the threat of desegregation, many white Christian churches formed private segregation academies, Christian academies, in the 60s and 70s, so the children of their members would not have to attend school with their black peers. More than 750,000 white children are estimated to have attended more than 3,000 segregated academies during that period, as public school systems were changed by a Supreme Court ruling upholding busing as a way to force desegregation. In 1970, North Carolina Supreme Court Justice I. Beverly Lake Jr. gave a speech to students and parents at Wake Christian Academy, a segregation academy in Raleigh, North Carolina, in which he denounced school desegregation. Lake noted, "The products of jungles were enrolling in public education." He opined that all white schools like Wake Christian Academy offer our state her best hope for safe passage through perilous times. Wake Christian Academy, like many of the segregation academies formed during that time, still operates today, but it is no longer segregated, at least not totally segregated. The school's website contains a statement on racial equality which says, "We are grieved that the school, which subsequently became Wake Christian Academy, was founded in 1966 by a group opposed to the integration of public schools. This was wrong and does not represent the biblical values that define us and the culture we have worked hard to create over the past several decades. Students from different races and ethnic backgrounds attend Wake Christian and have done so for many years. We are blessed as our school family becomes more diverse. The biblical values set forth above will continue to define us as long as Wake Christian Academy exists." Notwithstanding that egalitarian claim, the class pictures on the website reveal a very small number of non-white students in a state that is 22% Black. I counted 3 apparently African-American faces in the picture of the senior class, and a slightly larger number in the kindergarten class. So maybe they're making progress. As a practical matter, the cost of tuition and other factors result in Wake Christian Academy being a nearly all-white school today, although not legally segregated. In contrast, the public high school that my brothers and I attended in Siler City today has 820 students, of whom 59% are Hispanic, 12% Black, and 24% white. My parents were founding members of the Siler City Presbyterian Church in 1951. That was the church in which I was confirmed. In a relatively short time, membership grew to about 100 members and never more. Well, never more until recently, which is another story. The pianist and the choir, of which my father was a member, left much to be desired. Try as they might, their music was a distraction from worship. One Sunday, I entered the sanctuary to see the choir filled with robed Black people whom our founding pastor, had invited from a local Black church. The choral music that day was unlike anything I had ever experienced at church. It really lifted up the worship, but apparently the pastor had not consulted with the session, of which my father was the clerk, which is like the council in the UCC. And a great controversy resulted. There were expressions of anger in response to his temerity in inviting Black people into our church for any purpose other than for janitorial services. For a brief time, it sounded like he might be thrown out. The message was abundantly clear. Blacks are not welcome in the Siler City Presbyterian Church. During my high school years, I was active in the Presbyterian Youth Organization on a statewide basis. I had the opportunity to get to know a number of pastors, most of whom were recent graduates of seminary and in the early years of their careers. I talked with them about issues of racial equality and asked them to help me reconcile the message of the Gospels that I heard preached every Sunday with our practices of segregation and injustice. I was both puzzled and frustrated with the awkward non-answers that I received. No theological explanation was offered. The only reason provided was that white Christians believed it necessary to keep the races separate in order to avoid the risk of intermarriage. Greensboro, North Carolina was the nearest city to Siler City, which wasn't a city, which we would visit every couple of weeks to shop. As a child, I observed the separate restrooms and water fountains labeled white and colored that were typical of that era in department stores and other large commercial establishments. In 1960, during the second semester of my senior year of high school, a peaceful sit-in demonstration took place at the Woolworth's lunch counter in Greensboro, North Carolina, by 4 courageous young African-American college students. The sit-in was successful, and the national attention that it drew stimulated more than 100 similar nonviolent protests around the country. That was one of the first acts of civil disobedience in the emerging civil rights movement in the South. I silently cheered when the sit-in ended. The good guys won. My cheering was silent because by that time, the tension between me and my parents over the issue of racism had reached large proportions to the extent that we just didn't confront the issue frequently. That fall of 1960, I entered Florida Presbyterian College in St. Petersburg, Florida, as one of 154 members of the founding freshman class. That was the first year of operation for the college, which had been formed in a cooperative endeavor by the Northern and Southern Synods of the Presbyterian Church in Florida. At that time, Florida was the only state in the country that did not have a Presbyterian institution of higher learning. It was a unique opportunity and an extraordinary life-changing experience for me and for most of my classmates. The civil rights movement was picking up steam. John Kennedy was running for president that fall, and it was my first involvement in political activity. Most of the members of the founding faculty were members of CORE, NAACP, and other national civil rights organizations. Some of them marched in Selma, but they understood the risk of injury and arrest and did not allow students to accompany them. I participated in low-risk civil rights demonstrations in St. Petersburg, which made me feel very self-righteous and a part of the movement. When FPC was formed, it claimed to be open to the admission of students of any race, color, creed, or nationality, and to be need blind. We did not have a Black student in the founding freshman class, but we did have an Asian and a Hungarian refugee. Faculty and students alike assumed that when a qualified Black applied, he or she would be accepted, and in fact, there was an eagerness for that to happen. Following my sophomore year, I had returned home to North Carolina for the summer, and I received word from a classmate that the Board of Trustees had denied the admission of our first Black applicant, Howard Kennedy, a St. Petersburg resident and a transfer student who was graduating from the local Gibbs Junior College in St. Pete that year. Now, it's pretty unusual for boards of trustees of colleges to take place at individual admission decisions. So the decision had been made by the administration and they were overruled by the Board of Trustees. Upon learning of the board's decision, I immediately wrote the president and the dean of faculty and dean of admissions and informed them of my intent to withdraw from the college. I also wrote several of my fellow students and urged them to do likewise. Every member of the faculty resigned except for one. The Board of Trustees quickly relented and issued a statement that FPC would admit all qualified applicants regardless of race. But the damage had been done, and our first Black applicant had chosen to enter the Army before he learned of his admission to FPC. The college made a couple of mistakes. One was we probably lost a valuable donor, as Howard eventually completed his degree in chemistry after leaving the Army and created a very successful cosmetic manufacturing business in New Jersey. In 2009, while I was still serving on the Board of Trustees, we brought Howard Kennedy to campus at commencement. The story was told publicly. An apology was issued, and Howard was awarded an honorary doctorate. I was married at the end of my freshman year at FPC, and by the time I had finished my junior year, my first wife and I had 2 children. I was a precocious lad. The young college had not contemplated marriage students, and we were on our own to make living arrangements. For reasons of personal convenience and cost, I decided to enter Clemson University in the fall of 1963 to complete my senior year and to obtain my BS in chemistry. Clemson offered married student housing that had originally been built for returning veterans after World War II. The standalone 2-bedroom cottages rented for $27 per month. My year at Clemson contributed to my education in ways I had not expected and caused me to once again face the brutal realities of racism. The cultural differences from the small, nurturing environment at FPC could not have been more dramatic. 1963 was a significant year for Clemson, as it ceased its long history of being an all-white institution. The South Carolina Constitution still provided that its state-supported colleges and universities were required to remain segregated or risk losing state funding. In 1961, Harvey Gantt, a young black man from Charleston, South Carolina, applied for admission to the School of Architecture. When he was denied admission to Clemson because he was black, he instead entered Iowa State in architecture. With the assistance of one of the leading attorneys in South Carolina, he sued Clemson in federal court and was eventually successful at the Supreme Court. In the spring of 1963, Gant was admitted to the Clemson School of Architecture as the first black student in the school's history. Harvey was an upperclassman as an architecture student in a building on the remote side of campus. He did not attract a great deal of attention or controversy. In the fall of '63, Lucinda Brawley was admitted as a freshman and the second black student. Lucinda and I arrived at Clemson at the same time, although as a white male, I did not attract any attention. I often observed the treatment that Lucinda received. On several occasions, as I was changing classes, I saw Lucinda walking on campus between buildings, and I heard her being taunted and heckled in crude and profane ways. It was not pretty. At the end of that academic year, I was glad to accept my diploma and depart Clemson, which I had found to be a redneck culture in every sense of the term. The epigraph of Robert Jones' powerful book, White Too Long, is a quote from an article by James Baldwin published in the New York Times on February 2nd, 1969. In his article titled, "The Price May Be Too High," Baldwin writes about the challenge of black and white artists working together. But in a larger sense, he was also describing the challenge of black and white people working together at that time in our history, and perhaps even today. He said, "I will state flatly that the bulk of this country's white population impresses me and has so impressed me for a very long time as being beyond any conceivable hope of moral rehabilitation. They have been white, if I may so put it, too long. My entire adult life, I've lived with a sense of guilt and shame that comes from knowing that my family and the communities of which I've been a part have benefited from and perpetuated systemic racial inequities and white supremacy, and considered our white privilege from which we have derived great advantage to be deserved. Much of the time, I've been able to move that sense of guilt to my subconscious. But George Floyd's murder last May and the subsequent events in other cities reflecting the excessive use of force against blacks by mostly white police brought the pain of that sensibility back to the forefront. I believe racial inequity remains the most serious flaw in our society today and the major weakness in our democracy. Who would have imagined after the election and re-election of Barack Obama that our next president would be the head cheerleader in support of white supremacists and use the office of the president to promote division and hatred? On the other hand, I've seen many barriers to equal treatment under the law removed during my lifetime, and we are a far more open society than when I was growing up in the South. Some say that the beginning of multiracial democracy occurred in 1965 with the passage of the Voting Rights Act, which I believe was the greatest act of political courage in my lifetime. Lyndon Johnson knew full well the political risk to the Democratic Party when he used all of his political capital to secure passage of that landmark legislation. There are many additional reforms that can be and must be achieved through legislation and more effective application of existing law. But the most important reform must come from members of my race, acknowledging our explicit and implicit assertion of white supremacy and unlearning deeply ingrained attitudes and behavior in our exploitation of white privilege. Thank you for your attention and patience. Rush, would you like to invite comments?
Grover, yes, Grover, thank you very much for that presentation. We will stop the recording now.